Howdy folks. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Heroku, which is a very popular cloud hosting system for Node.js applications, and it's the one that we're recommended to use for this class. So you should hopefully already have Heroku set up and gone through all the setup to get your credits. I'm not going to cover that here because that's a bit of a involved process and I don't actually have the necessary accesses as I'm not a student to do that. But once you're in Heroku, there's a couple things to note. Your apps show up here. You can create new apps here or here. Don't worry too much about pipelines yet. Pipelines are if you have multiple applications that you want to have go in a list, like maybe you have a staging environment that your changes go to automatically, and that's what you test on, and then when you're ready, you push that to your production environment. We're not building projects complicated enough for that, so I wouldn't worry about that yet, but it's something that if you're interested, you could look into a little later. So there's a couple things for apps. If you create a new app, first you give it a name, and there's a couple ways that Heroku handles apps. They used to have a free tier, they do not anymore. So the new things they have a single dyno, which is what DYNO, which is what Heroku calls its servers that runs, is $7 a month. And that's kind of expensive. So they actually do have, if you go into your account settings and click on billing, they do have an eco tier. So you'll have some credits here probably. Run apps using your monthly pool of eco-dyno hours. Eco-dyno apps sleep automatically after a period of inactivity. So eco apps are kind of, they behave similarly to how free tier apps used to behave in Heroku. So they go to sleep after half an hour of not being used, which means that if you try to access them while they're asleep, they don't respond immediately. They take a little bit of time to spin up and get going again whenever they're accessed. So you have 1,000 hours, which is probably going to be more than enough unless your application is actively being used, in which case I would use a hobby tier dyno, which we'll cover in a bit. Subscribing to this is $5 a month, which should be well within your credits, those of you that have credits. And it applies across all your eco dynos. So you can make as many dynos as you want, and this 1,000 hours is split among them. What is the downside of that? Well, the downside of that is that you only have 1,000 hours and they go to sleep. However, if you use non-eco dynos and you use the hobby tier, which is $7 a month, it's $7 per dyno. So if you have 10 of them, it's going to be $70 a month. Whereas if you have 10 of them on eco, it's just 1,000 hours that they split among them. So I'm going to click on subscribe to eco. Okay, $5 a month, billing start date, etc., etc. This might look a little different than on yours because you have credits. Click subscribe. Okay, I've used 0 this month. That's nice of them to tell me. So I'm going to go back. Just click on the little Heroku icon up here. And let's create an app. So before you deploy anything to Heroku, you have to create an application. So I'm going to go up here to New, Create New App. And you have to give it a name. The name must be unique across the Heroku platform. It is not unique to your account. It's unique to everywhere. So if you pick something like test, well, test is not available because someone's probably already picked that. So I'm going to pick Robert Test, which is available because it's unlikely anyone would have picked my name. Okay. So there's 2 regions. United States is probably a fine region to use. Don't add to pipeline because we're not dealing with pipelines. If you get to pipelines, this is how you would do it. I'm going to say create the app. Okay. So now here's the app. It's on the deploy. It just tells you how to do the deployment. And I'm going to look at overview here. Okay. Dyno formation has no process types yet. That's fine. We'll get into that after we push code, and no add-ons. We'll figure that out in a minute. So we have no more free databases for Postgres and Heroku. For Redis, there are a couple other free databases that you can use, and we'll talk about those. So how to deploy this? The first thing you need is the Heroku CLI. Heroku CLI. So go through the instructions here to install. There's one for OS X, there's one for Windows. Let me just make sure I have this already on here. So if you type Heroku, I should get something. There we go. So you see all these commands. I have the Heroku CLI. The main thing that you're going to need to do is run Heroku login. Oops. And what that does is that's important because when we're pushing code up to Heroku, it uses this login to ensure that you are the person that you say you are. It doesn't use SSH keys like GitHub does. So I say Heroku login. It says press any key to open up the browser. I press a key. It opens up this page. And if you're already logged into Heroku, it just shows you this button. Click on that. And it says you can close this page and return to your CLI. I return to my CLI and it says, hey, you're now logged in as this person. It knew this was a special key it gave that it was checking. So now I'm logged in. Cool. So let's take a look at the code that we need to put in. So here, I have a very simple Express server set up. I've got my package.json with a name, version, all this stuff doesn't really matter. Dependencies are important. Heroku will install these for you. You can put node modules in your git ignore, so it doesn't actually show up in git. Totally fine. And here I've got my server. Pretty simple. It just listens on / and says hello world to the browser. Easy enough for us to test. It listens on port 3001. Okay, so Heroku uses git to push. So let's see how that works. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run git init to create a git repository. Initialize empty git repository. You can see all these changes here. All right. So the next thing we need to do is we need to add a remote. So if you've already got a remote on your git, if you've already like cloned this from GitHub, and you run git remote list, oops, or is it git remote v? Git remote v, you'll already have an origin here. So we're going to make a new remote. So let's go back to your app here. You can go to deploy. The deploy tab is probably fine because it has instructions here. They have a command here and how you do it. You can use the Heroku app to do it. So you can run Heroku git remote. -a stands for the app. So you're basically telling Heroku, I need you to run the git command to create a remote for this particular app. The other way you can do it, so yeah, if you want to run this command, this works for you, I would definitely recommend this. The other way is if you go into settings, the git URL is right here. So then you can just copy this and run git remote add, and then the name of the remote, which is going to be Heroku, and then the URL. Oh, not a git repository. Blah, blah, blah. Oh, because I'm not in the right spot. This is my terminal. And this is my terminal here. Remote add Heroku there. And then if I run git remote v, you can see that's been added. Remove Heroku. Just remove that so that I can show you the other way of doing it. So this command will work fine. Probably without the tilde. I don't know why that was in there. But if you go to the deploy tab and you run this Heroku git remote command, oops, this will also work just as well. Takes a minute because it's actually having to go to the remote server and get that data, but you see set remote, and then I run it and that remote is there again. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do my push via this terminal because I want it a little bigger so you can see what actually happens. So let's go to Heroku test. So we have these files, so let's git add, git status, commit, and first commit. So now, deploying to Heroku is as simple as pushing to that remote. So remember, normally we've said, oh, you know, git push origin main, or git push -u origin main. So origin is the name of the remote. So for this, we're actually going to say git push Heroku main, because that is the name of the remote that we have here. If you've got multiple remotes, you'll see multiple entries here. You'll probably see origin. I don't have an origin on this one, so I don't see it. Okay, so let's run that. Okay, so it goes through its normal counting object, etc. Now you can see, let's take a look at this. All this remote Remote is messages that come from the remote Git server. So Heroku says building on the Heroku 22 stack. This is the Heroku build message. It's telling you, hey, I am now building your application. Let's deploy this. Heroku 22 is the most modern stack for 2022. It says determining what build pack to use for this app, Node.js app detected. The build pack for Heroku is a series of code that basically tells it, based on what your server is, how to build it. So if you're running a Ruby on Rails server, or you're running a Java server, or you're running a PHP server, it will use different build packs. There's also a build pack for static servers, where it detects Node.js because of our package JSON, most likely. And it says, okay, I'm going to use the Node.js build pack. Creating runtime environment. You can see it sets a bunch of environment variables. It installs binaries. This is an interesting thing, engines.node, engines.npm. If you want, you can actually put in your package JSON what version of Node and npm you want it to use. That's usually not that useful for smaller projects, but for larger projects, sometimes you haven't upgraded because of some dependency or some bug, so you want to lock your Node version. You can do that here, and Heroku will respect that. It says, okay, we're using Node version 18. Download and installing, using default npm version, installing dependencies, and you can see it does an npm install. Adding 57 packages, audit 58 packages, looking for funding, blah, blah, blah. This is the normal npm stuff, right? Then it goes to build. It says, okay, first we're caching our Node modules. Then it removes dev dependencies. So what Heroku does is, if you have dev dependencies are something in package JSON, which you're basically saying these dependencies only exist or only are useful for when you're developing the system. They're not actually useful for when you're deploying it. So something like that could be Jest. Jest is a dev dependency because you're going to be running tests on your local machine. You're going to be running them in your CI pipeline. You're probably not running your tests in your production environment. At least you shouldn't be. And at least you shouldn't be running the actual test code in the production environment. So Jest will be a dev dependency, meaning that you don't want Jest to be pushed to your main production server. And that's what this does. It removes the dev dependencies out so that it just gets rid of that code. I don't know why they install the dev dependencies in the beginning. That's just how Heroku works. Build succeeded. Discovering process types. So now, if you have a Procfile, which you can look up later, and sometimes you need this, Heroku will actually look at your Procfile. If you're running multiple different processes, or you want to run from the same repository, you need a Procfile to determine what they are and what their start commands are. That's a little bit more advanced, and you're probably not going to need to deal with that for any of the projects that we're working on. So it knows that because it's a node thing, it just defaults to, okay, this is a web, and it knows how to handle that. Compressing, done, launching, released. It'll say version 3 sometimes. Every time you change a configuration variable or anything like that, it's a new release version. So this won't always be v1. Deploy to Heroku. So let's take a look. Now if we go back here to overview, you can see it has a deploy and the build succeeded. Still no dyno formation, so something must have gone a little wrong there. Let's look at our logs. So we click view logs. Okay. It says Heroku start. It runs node server.js. See, Heroku is smart enough to realize that that's probably what you want to start. And app listing import 3001, and then we've got a timeout shortly afterwards, about a minute later. Web process failed to bind to port. So there's a reason that happened. But let's talk over a little bit of this first. Go our overview. Oh, there we go. This app is using ecodynos. Because I've signed up for the eco plan, you can see web runs npm start. So if I go to configure dynos and change dyno type, I could actually go for a basic, which I guess is what they're calling their hobby now. And you can see this is $7 per dyno per month. For 1 hour, it costs you roughly 1 cent. Small scale personal projects and apps that don't need scaling. Ecos for experimentation or things that you don't think you're going to be using that much. Then there's these ones which are just more performance. And so if you want to use a basic, it's $7 a month per dyno, which is probably fine. and you can see it wants to run npm start. If I have more proc stuff in my Procfile, I can have more. There's ways to do add-ons. Activity shows all the stuff that's happened, so you can see I ran a build that succeeded. If I open the app, you see it gives me an error because the app actually crashed. So let's go back to those logs. App crashed, failed to bind to port. Well, the reason is Heroku doesn't listen on port 3001. Heroku gives you its own port. Heroku is actually running our application on a server with a bunch of other applications. So it determines what the best port is for us that it wants this traffic to listen on, and it tells us what that is as part of the environment variable. And if we don't listen on that port, it just turns off the app. It says, hey, nothing's listening on this port. This is a problem. So what we're going to do, because it puts in the environment variables, I'm going to do this. First of all, I'm going to say port equals process.m.port, because that is the environment variable that Heroku uses to start that up. Now here's the issue. If I now start this up, it says listening on port undefined because I didn't define a port. Now I could make an .env file and put a port. The other thing I could do though is I could just say, okay, or, so the or branch happens if this is false. So let's say, okay, this or 3001. Why do I do that? Well, I do that because it's kind of useful to have my own local thing, and on local environments I don't have a port. And I don't necessarily want to have to put one in my process env. So I can say, okay, process env port. If there is a port existing in the process environment, then use that. Otherwise, fall back to 3001. Okay. The other thing I can do is I don't actually have an npm start command. Heroku kind of figures it out because I called my file server and it was top level and it's smart enough for that. But if you want to be specific, you can actually put a start command in here and just say node server.js. So if you have your entry point somewhere else and npm seems like it's not finding it, this would be a good way to do it. The other thing we could set up here is we actually could set up a Procfile. So let's look at what that looks like. The Procfile. Process types. The Procfile is simply a simple text file named Procfile and must live in the app's root directory without a file extension. So here, if I say Procfile, and you can see VS Code actually recognizes that this is a Heroku Procfile. So it gives it that little Heroku symbol. So what do we put in this? Format process type and command. So we could actually say, okay, web npm start, because that's the command we want to run. If we had another one in here, like maybe we had 2 different servers that we want to run, we could put another one in here, that other server. So let's add all this, changes, fix some Heroku port issues. And then what happens if we publish this? Is this going to do what I think it should? Yeah, it looks like it might. So VS Code might actually work with this because I've only got one origin. So let's go back here and let's look at our deploy, or sorry, our activity. Build in progress. So if we look at this, we can also get that same list. Building here using build pack, Node.js detected, installing binaries, blah, 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 up to date, dev. Oh, so now you see it says we'd found a Procfile, because I gave it a Procfile. So it looks at that and says Procfile declare types web. It won't make too much of a difference for this. If I go back here, it's still got web, npm start. And now if I look at activity, I can see that build succeeded and it deployed version 4. You can also roll back any versions. This includes config changes, code changes, whatever. So if you screw something up and you need it fixed in a hurry, you can just click roll back and it'll roll it back. What it actually does is it makes a new deploy, or a new deploy version that has that old code or configuration, which can be a little confusing. So let's look at the logs again. All right. Start node server.js, app listing on port, and you can see the port they gave is 11936. That might be different for every single one. State change from crash to starting. State change from starting to up. Up is what we want to see. So now, if I click open app, there it is, hello world. I can send this to anyone, and they'll be able to get this same thing. All right, so that is how you deploy an app to Heroku. The important thing is The Procfile is kind of optional if you set things up properly. The start is good to have. This is important though, the process env port, that you have to be listening on that specific port. All right, so let's take a look at how Heroku handles databases. So if you want databases, you go to the Resources tab. Resources, Heroku handles stuff like databases and logging and a bunch of stuff like that in add-ons. So if you look at the add-ons library, there's a bunch of different categories here: search, queuing, services, dyno, security, email, all sorts of stuff. So like if I look at email, there's a bunch of different things here. Like there's a Mailgun integration. There's a Twilio integration for SMS stuff. I guess Twilio is for email as well. So if you need something that you can hook up your own stuff pretty easily, but Heroku also takes care of this stuff for you. One thing that's important about it is it also takes care of rotating your passwords. So if you have a password for a database, for instance, and it's managed through Heroku, not only do they handle, if you're paying for it, they handle the billing, but they also handle rotation of passwords as necessary, which can be really nice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look up MySQL, and any of these are probably pretty good. Let's try ClearDB, okay? And let's, they have a free plan. They have a bunch of other plans. Like, wow, that's an extremely expensive plan. Oh, there's a lot of noise going on in the background from my washing machine. Hopefully you can't hear that. Let's view the details. You should always view the details just to make sure it's something that works for you. So what I'm doing is I don't care about any of this. This is all pretty normal. What I want to see, here we go. I want to see how much they give. So they give 5 megabytes of storage. That's not a lot of database. 5 megabytes is pretty small, but maybe that doesn't matter that much. Maybe you're just really working with some application, you need to store a little bit of data, you don't expect it to be much. This is probably fine. They have 1 gigabyte if you want to pay $10 a month. Again, if you have credits with Heroku, this will come out of your credits. I wouldn't recommend that for any of the projects that you're building, though, because this should probably be fine. So, you know, a couple things. You can click this button. You can run this CLI, or if you're in the Resources tab here, you can just say Submit Order Form. Okay, I think I broke it. Oh, there it is. And, oh, now I did it twice. Okay, well, now we can see how to delete it. So you just delete the add-on. And you have to enter your app name just to make sure. Okay, ClearDB. You click on this, it'll actually take you to the administration panel for this. Because the add-ons SSO Heroku Secure Login, it takes you to this particular database. And this is through who it's hosted through. I click on this, and it shows me like how much memory I'm using, CPU, threads, etc., etc. Bunch of stuff. The thing that, how do you use this? If you go to settings again, here's the thing, config vars. Remember, we've been using .env for a lot of our stuff in process.env. Config vars show up in the environment. So let's look. ClearDB database URL. Heroku has put this in here for us, and it manages this for us. So this is what we want to use. So if we copy this and we take a look at it in our code, username, password, host, oops, database, and connection options. So you could actually pick this apart and do a bunch of stuff with it. However, most of the connector systems like MySQL 2 or CLIs or anything like that know how to work with this. So if you do need to work with this, let's actually make a let's make our regular, our DB connection. All right. So let's say connection.js, and then I'm going to install MySQL 2. Okay. So then equals require MySQL 2, and let's look at the documentation for MySQL 2. So we go here, connection, first query. So MySQL create connection. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to look this up to find the individual, where is the document? Okay. Connection options. So I don't see it here. It's probably just URL, but I want to make sure. MySQL to connection with URL. Okay. MySQL to npm, just so we get that. Okay, Node.js, specimen pad and password and connection string. Okay, that's not helpful. I need to see the actual code. This is a connection string parser. Create connection. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, nobody else is providing anything useful. Let's just try it. So, connection equals MySQL dot create connection, and I think I can just say URL. Oh yeah, you can see URI. Okay, so then I'm gonna say process.env, and let's check in Heroku what we actually called that. It was called the ClearDB database URL. I don't want to take this value, but what I want to do, is I want to put that in here. Connection, and then module.exports equals connection. So let's do a very simple test here. Let's import this here. db acquire config connection, and then I want to actually make a query here. So const result equals await db.query, select 1 + 1 as num. I mean, we know what 1 + 1 is. This just verifies that the connection to the SQL database is working. So what we should expect one row with num. Let's do this. Let's res.json result. Save that. All this here, add SQL. All right. We push that up. It goes, and if I look at activity, see another build happening. You can also see when I make all of these provisioning changes, it made new versions. So if you need to roll back a configuration change, you can do it here as well. Let's see what we got. All right, it's already got down to the point where it's compressing, done. And it should be deploying it shortly. Build in progress. Build succeeded. It's taking a little while, isn't it? I wonder what happened. Let's take a look at the logs. Okay. Build start. Okay, there we go. Stopping all processes. Starting process. And ignoring a valid configuration reconnect. Okay. So basically that means that reconnect string, this SQL system doesn't know how to handle it. But that's good because that means that it actually ran. So let's see if we open this. We get an error. Ooh, what error did we get? Okay. You have tried to call then catch or invoked await on a result of a query that is not a promise. That's fair because DB query doesn't return promises, does it? That's on me. All right, let's do it this way because DB query actually uses a callback. So that's fine. We can handle a callback in there perfectly well. We just got to take this, switch DB to callback, commit. And again, you can see this is very easy to push new code up here. We're just pushing it. I wouldn't recommend you push every commit. So maybe set it up so that you, as you're developing your project, you have specific intervals where you push up to Heroku. But yeah, otherwise it's pretty easy. You can see we just done it twice. And oops, activity, it's making a new build, launching it. Oops, let's go to our logs again. Okay, looks like it's up. Open the app, and there we go. We have our result from the SQL query. So now we know MySQL is actually connected to our Heroku application. So then if you need to do this locally, you can also add something like ClearDB, or you can have a conditional in here that says, oh, you know, if I have the ClearDB URL, use that. Otherwise use like the host username password like we're used to from .env. So that can be how you do this working with your own database on local as well as push it to Heroku. So that's about it. These logs are temporary. They don't stick around for very long. So like if I reload here, you can see those other ones are gone. And now I'm getting build succeeded logs, which is a little interesting. So if you really do want to save your logs for crashes and stuff like that, you have to set up an actual logging system, which is kind of outside the scope of this tutorial. Oh, that's funny. Server closed the connection. So we actually lost our SQL connection here, which makes sense. That's what that reconnect is. We probably actually have to put something special in the MySQL 2 connector to get it to reconnect appropriately. So if you run into this, that's probably what it is, those little crashes. MySQL will sometimes do this. It'll just terminate the connection if you're not sending any queries down it. And there's other ways that we can handle that, but that's going to be part of another video. So hopefully this is helpful with getting Heroku set up and working. And I will see you all next time.